I think, in Silicon Valley, there's this talk of, fail fast, fail often. And I've heard some that sort of push a point, a little bit of counterbalance of, well, let's not have a failure fetish. Failure
Right.
in and of itself is not great. Failure might be expected. And then I think how we respond to those failures or mistakes are key. Because I think part of the Silicon Valley idea is cycles of learning.
Right.
We've had a failure, we've made a mistake. Let's learn from it. Let's move forward better. Going back to Toyota, my mentors there would talk about small tests of change, which means small failures as a way of preventing large failures. And to me, that's where, there's parallels in this quote unquote lean startup methodology. You want to make mistakes early so that you can adjust and get as much of it as you figured out, get as much of it figured out as you can before you try to scale the business.
I took away tons from that conversation. Like I said, I've got a full page of notes here. And so a couple highlights from what I learned from Mark today. So first, naturally, we all make mistakes. I think that's easily said and obvious, but I think it's a good reminder for us to think that we're perfect is just not realistic. And it can really not only set us up from opportunities where we could learn because we're not making those mistakes, but it can also put a lot more anxiety and pressure on us than probably necessary. So when I asked Mark, so what were some things that we could do better? The first thing he said was, well, first, not beat yourself up. So when you do make a mistake, try and ask yourself pretty quickly, what can I learn from that? How can I use that to get better and faster? And then we talked about kind of organizationally, same kind of idea. What can we learn? And as Mark said several times, he said mistakes are almost always systemic. They're really not about the individual person. There's usually something bigger. So how do we create environments where we can acknowledge that, share that? He talked a lot about psychological safety. That must be one of the themes of my shows in 2021. That topic seems to keep coming up. And he said you have to have enough psychological safety in the space, in the meetings, in the environment for people to be able to not only make mistakes, but what I love that he said that I don't often talk about, but I should, is he said you got to be able to challenge the status quo. And you have to have enough psychological safety to be able to challenge the status quo. So how do we create that environment? We want to avoid things like naming, blaming, and shaming. He said he sees a lot of that in healthcare, and that creates covering up. So we want to kind of do that. And one of the ways we can do that is he mentioned Toyota and the andon cord, which is the cord that they can pull on the assembly line if they have an error. And so how do we create kind of that kind of mechanism where people can raise their hand and ask for help or let us know if a mistake's been made quickly so we can jump in and without the fear that they're going to get punished. And then even fun things like having a contest for who had the best mistake this particular month or this particular quarter. So I took away a lot from Mark, and it's already got me thinking about some of the mistakes I've made and how I can continue to learn from them. Hopefully I am. So here's to a kind of a quick learning and mistake full 2021 where you all not only can make them but quickly bounce back. And as Mark said, we want to kind of learn how to fail fast so we can learn quickly and always reinvent. So here's to a great 2021 for you.
The Workplace Therapist Show is sponsored by the Leadership Foundry. Bringing a cutting-edge, real-world approach to leadership development, the Leadership Foundry partners with each client organization to create a custom-tailored experience, virtual or in person, that combines innovative leadership content, world-class facilitators, and one-on-one coaching to ensure your leaders have everything they need to grow and thrive. To find out more and to design your one-of-a-kind program, visit myleadershipfoundry.com.
Mark, really excited to have you on the show today. Excited for our topic about celebrating mistakes and figuring out not only how we can learn from those, but creating environments of psychological safety where people feel comfortable doing that. But just generally, just excited about all the different directions we can kind of take our conversation today. So before we jump in, we were talking about it before the show, you wear lots of hats. So author, speaker, consultant, podcaster, solopreneur, and that's just the beginning. So would love to kind of get a little sense from you of what's been your journey up to this point before we kind of dive into our topic. I'd be really curious.
Well, thank you, Brendan, for having me here. And, my career journey has deviated from what I thought my career plan was going to be in a couple of different ways. I graduated college 25 years, a little more than 25 years ago, industrial engineering degree. I thought, I was going to work in manufacturing my whole career. Different leadership type roles is what I aspired to. B, I thought I was going to work for large corporations my entire career.
I totally get that.
And that was going according to plan. I had a chance to go to grad school full time for 2 years, and I came back to a large corporate environment. My second employer was 1/10 the size of my first, going from like 300,000 employees globally to 30,000 employees. And then I started realizing, like, maybe this is not a good fit for me. I went and worked for a startup software company in Austin, Texas for about 4 years. Let the pendulum swing way too far to go work for another large global manufacturing company. And then in 2005, there was some serendipity where I had the opportunity to start applying what I had learned in the manufacturing realm into healthcare. And that's been my primary focus for 15 plus years now, applying ideas from engineering, systems design, leadership and management concepts as a consultant in healthcare. So now, I've ended up, as a solopreneur who often partners up and works with different organizations that are still small-ish, but usually serving clients that are 10,000 plus employees. So I get exposed enough to the big organization environment, but doing so in a different way than I thought my career was going to play out.
So your podcast, My Favorite Mistake, now how did that come about? What kind of sparked that for you?
So I think, the work that I do is based around concepts that often get labeled as the Toyota production system. I started my career in the automotive industry. General Motors was clearly trying to catch up to Toyota by copying as much of the Toyota playbook as they could.
Yeah.
This often gets described more broadly as quote unquote lean manufacturing, or in startup circles, there's a methodology that's related called lean startup. And so I think one of the core leadership philosophies or organizational culture elements of this quote unquote lean approach is not blaming individuals for systemic problems. And then this is where, if this were a documentary, the narrator might jump in and say, there are almost always systemic problems. And there are different problems that could be labeled as mistakes in a workplace. And I think there are two elements of when that happens, is it fair and just to the employee to punish them for said mistake? And is it better for the organization in the long run? Whether it's a factory or a software company or a hospital, is it better for the organization to punish the individual? And I would say, no, it's not better for the organization. So this idea of creating an environment where it's safe for people to point out mistakes, whether they had a role in creating it, whether they were involved, or it's just a problem they see the effect of. That's such an important part of this lean and Toyota-based methodology, where, I think then in different ways, I wrote a book, or I was writer / editor / publisher of a book a few years back called Practicing Lean, where 15 other authors and myself shared a story early in our career of something that we would have considered a mistake that was born out of inexperience and enthusiasm, maybe. And what did we learn from that? And reflecting about it, and sort of, and the one core theme of that book, Practicing Lean, was this idea of, look, we all make mistakes. And some of it's a reminder to myself to not be too judgmental when somebody else who is early in their career or early in their practice makes a quote unquote mistake. Yeah. And so then the podcast came about last year, where, I've been podcasting for 15 years now in this sort of niche area of what we call lean. And I would get pitched different guests, PR firms reach out and say, hey, would you like to interview so-and-so? And I found myself saying no, but I thought, I had this regret of, well, they sound really fascinating, but they don't fit my niche. And then last year, somebody had pitched Kevin Harrington, who was one of the original sharks on the show Shark Tank.
Yeah.
He had co-authored a book with another entrepreneur named Mark Tim. And I thought, I don't want to say no to this guy from Shark Tank. Let me find a way to say yes. And so then after some conversations back and forth with a couple of these PR firms, so what do you think about a podcast called My Favorite Mistake, which is also partly inspired by the Sheryl Crow song of that title.
Yeah.
And so Kevin Harrington, thankfully, was cool with the idea, and many, many other guests have been thankfully willing to come and share a story about a mistake from their career that was a favorite because it was a good learning opportunity.
Well, I love how you've
really
already kind of set this up, that it's not so much the mistake, it's what do we learn from it.
Yeah,
I love that. I love that you've spun it that way and really kind of put that burden on us, but an important burden, to reflect on those and say, how did that make me better, faster, smarter, whatever, improvement word we can use there. So, okay, so when you think about your show, what have been some of the takeaways from what you've been hearing from some of those mistakes? Are you noticing any patterns that when people talk about their favorite mistake, how it shaped them or changed their life in a positive way?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there are a couple of patterns. Probably at least half the time when I ask my guests, what's your favorite mistake? At least half the time they'll say something along the lines of, oh my gosh, I really had to think hard about which one was my favorite because I've made so many mistakes. And I think the willingness
almost like your children, like I love them all equally, but these are...
Yeah. Well, so and the show is not called my biggest mistake, right? Because it's not a show about, feeling sorry for ourselves or wallowing in like this soul crushing mistake. I mean, sometimes a favorite mistake is also a big mistake, but, I think back to the point of willingness to admit that we make mistakes. I think especially like when they've had some, people on my podcast are very accomplished, very successful people. And I think maybe it sets a tone for others who are earlier in their career or looking to be an entrepreneur who might think, well, I'm not going to make it unless I'm perfect. Well, here's the punchline of the story. Nobody's perfect. Even incredibly successful entrepreneurs have some mistake along the way. Like Kevin Harrington talked about a mistake that was related to, credit card processing and bank accounts related to different infomercials that he was running. It was a mistake that almost put him out of business because his cash flow got cut off. And the fact that he would share that and talk about how he learned from it and bounced back and made some systemic changes to his business to make sure he wasn't put in that position again of the risk that he faced. I think that's powerful. So I think pattern one is everybody makes mistakes. Some of us, maybe not everybody learns from them. And then I think there are categories of mistakes. One are the mistake that they recognize to be a mistake, but in a way it led to something positive. And then I think there's a category of things where, I thought I had made the right decision, but then over time it revealed itself to be a mistake. And that pattern of reflection of saying, well, what would I have done differently, and more importantly, what can I do differently in the future? I think those are some of the themes that come out of the stories that people tell.
Yes, I wrote down a couple words when I was hearing you talk. It almost feels like a process to me. Like there's the first step is a willingness to be vulnerable, right? Even put ourselves out there to do something that could be a mistake. Like some level of risk, right? We move across the country, or we take a new job, or we start up a business, or whatever it happens to be. And then if we are willing to and able to, it can lead to continuous improvement. So there's vulnerability to continuous improvement, which then can lead to resilience, which then the cycle starts over again in a way that's hopefully is virtuous.
Yeah.
So am I onto it? Does that feel right to you?
Yeah, and the work that I've done, around a lot of times, this lean methodology focuses a lot on cycles of continuous improvement. And I think whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you're trying to improve something in the workplace, there's this expression: if you're not making mistakes, you're not trying hard enough. Yeah. Like there are bound to be mistakes, and I think so. As an engineer or a continuous improvement professional, maybe we try to strike the balance of not being reckless, but at the same time not being so cautious that we might not ever make a mistake. So, launching My Favorite Mistake as a podcast could have been a mistake, right? So I very quickly
wouldn't
had
that have been ironic? Wouldn't that have been so ironic?
well, so I think the risk, or thinking like an entrepreneur, the hypothesis I had was people will be willing to be a guest and share mistake stories. So I had Kevin Harrington, and then I had reached out through a friend I had met once. He's now former Congressman Will Hurd from Texas. And he was willing to be a guest. He was still in office. And I thought it was really brave of him, or vulnerable, to tell a story about how he lost his first election. Or I should say, he lost the runoff. And where a lot of politicians might be quick to throw a consultant under the bus for giving them bad advice, he was the opposite. He was like, that basically it was all on him. He ignored the advice of consultants. And, he took ownership, and then he learned from it, and then he did win election. And then later he won re-election. But then beyond that, there was this risk of like, well, what if nobody else wants to come on the show? But thankfully there's been an abundance of people who are willing to do that. So I would say that was not a mistake. That was, I think, a reasonable risk worth taking, because if I shut the podcast down after 2 episodes, like, all right, no big deal.
Okay, so here's a great pivot. For people listening, so we got 2 different lenses we can look through. How do I get more comfortable making mistakes? And how can I create environments where mistakes are celebrated? So right. It's like choose your own adventure. Mark, which one do you want to go down first?
Well, I think there's that personal path, and then there's the organizational path and questions. So maybe as an individual, and look, I try to remind myself this all the time, of not being too hard on myself when I make a mistake. I think as a kid, I was this little perfectionist, and I've struggled with that, where perfectionism can either make you afraid to move forward because something's not perfect. I think I've gotten better about that. But then there's the tendency, to maybe to beat yourself up and be too hard on yourself, which is different than let's say your boss being, and I don't like the word boss, but so your CEO at your startup coming down on you because of a mistake. So I think at first is sort of that personal journey around how to be more kind to yourself when you've made a mistake. And instead of spending time being upset, like moving past that as quickly as possible into the questions of, well, how did this mistake occur? What could I do to prevent it in the future? I think that's a little bit of the personal path. You're being therapist to yourself, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I have a client of mine, and he sent me this video of himself doing a presentation, executive level presentation. And he just got stuck in the very beginning. Like his mind went blank. And he said it felt like hours. And he said, I'm so sorry, I have to start over. I had to go behind the podium, and he started over, and then he delivered it, and it was great.
Yeah.
But he was beating himself up on this. He said, I'm so humiliated. It was horrible. And I watched the whole thing, and I said, you know what? If I had to grade it as an executive level presentation, it's a B-. It's B-. It's not a C, it's not a D, it's not an F, it's a B-. And it wasn't bad at all. You had an opportunity to get better, but it wasn't bad at all. But it was his self-talk that not only did he do after the fact, but he did it in the moment, which is what actually got him stuck, right? He was like, you're screwing this up. And then pretty soon he was screwing it up. So I think you're onto something really important and powerful, which is our self-talk. But sometimes that can be hard to stop those voices.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's easier now, maybe, to talk about organizations. How do we create a culture where people can safely talk about mistakes and do so in a way that's not focused on blame and punishment, but instead, focus on learning and improvement. I found it sometimes easier when I'm an observer to a situation to step back and say, okay, well, I know this is a systemic problem, or I suspect it to be a systemic problem until proven otherwise. It's easier to step back and say, well, okay, let's not blame that individual. Let's learn from it. it's easier to do that sometimes than it is to stifle the self-criticism when I make a mistake.
Yeah.
That has helped me, I think, understand the way, even if I've been involved, let's say, in a software company, KaiNexus, that I've been involved with for different ways for 10 years. We had a situation, here's a very practical, quick story. I was running a webinar where I was the host and moderator and somebody was presenting. Somebody else from the company started a meeting on that account and it killed the webinar instantly. Halfway through the webinar, we just went radio silent. People got notifications that says the webinar has ended.
Oh no.
And oh no. And I did go through a cycle of, so a lot of times we think, well, who did that?
That's right.
Well, I know who did it because there's only one other person who had access to the account. The question then is to step back. Once we were able to get the webinar back up and running and come up with that immediate containment of the problem, reaching out to that person and have a conversation. So especially once the moment had passed, I'm not the type of leader who's going to yell at somebody. Why'd you do that? What's wrong with you? Blah, blah, blah. We were going through, and it turned out there were a couple of procedural things that helped lead to that scheduling conflict and his unawareness of it. But he felt so bad about it. And that's where I try to remember it. Like, I feel bad about mistakes I make. He felt so bad about it. Like anything I would have done beyond saying, you know what, it's okay, would have been really, piling on in a way that wouldn't have been helpful at all. And so I was trying to play a little bit the role of therapist of helping him feel less upset about it. Like it's okay. It's nobody got hurt. We recorded the second half of it. We'll send it out. We'll edit it together. Look, there's really no harm done. The presenter was fine, and sort of helping him come back from the feeling bad. So then we could focus on, we came up with a pretty solid plan for how this is never going to happen again. Mainly, we're not going to share an account again, which is the advice. Zoom, that's the advice is, if you can ask Zoom, why didn't you build in a systemic protection to prevent doing that? And they're like, well, you're not supposed to be sharing accounts. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. So so let's pivot into creating environments, contexts for mistakes to be, I don't want to say encouraged, but at least celebrated. And
sure.
As a kind of a CEO of a kind of a technology startup once shared with me, this was one of their mantras in the company. It's now gotten to be a large company, but he said, don't throw away something that didn't work. Like, put it in the parts bin, because there might be part of it that we can pull off later and use for something else. Right. So how do you create those kind of environments or that kind of spirit? What have you seen work?
So I think a lot of it comes back to there's a concept that has really been framed and popularized by Professor Amy Edmondson from Harvard Business School of what she calls psychological safety.
Yeah.
Which amongst other things, it's a safety to speak up with an idea, to challenge the status quo, to point out and to admit, hey, I've made a mistake, in a way that is safe from blame, retaliation, humiliation, things like that. And I think, Toyota has done an amazing job of trying to create that culture. If you have a chance to, you can do a virtual tour online these days. Toyota has something they call the andon cord. Andon just means signal. And if there is a problem, or even as a production worker, if I've made a mistake where I grab a part and before I can install it, I drop that part. I think of like where I started my career at General Motors, in a blame and shame culture, you would get yelled at for dropping the part. And so then you might be tempted to cover up, like, did anyone see me drop that part? No? Okay, I'm going to install it, and it might be defective, but you know what? It's not my problem anymore. Someone else will catch it or fix it or whatever. So creating that safety for someone to reach up and physically pull a cord that calls their team leader over, where the culture would be to say, I dropped the part. And then the team leader would help with the immediate aftermath of, let's make sure this part doesn't get used. Let me get you a replacement. But then if that part's being dropped a lot, you would stop and say, is that part too slippery? Right? You start looking for design or system elements. Are other people also dropping that part? right? So you don't just lecture the worker for being clumsy or, God forbid, fire them. So how you respond when people point out a problem is really critically important. When I've been working in healthcare, there's this very common dynamic. People will talk about naming, blaming, and shaming. And it's completely counterproductive when there's a mistake or an error that harms a patient. The blame and shame cycle leads, again, to people hiding and covering up the problem. And when we can't admit there's a problem, we can't have any hope of addressing it constructively in a way that eliminates the risk of that problem reoccurring.
I think that's really, really all very powerful. Have you ever seen any cases where managers and leaders have actually facilitated conversations around, almost like your podcast, like, well, let's everyone go around and talk about our favorite mistake, what we can learn from that?
I've had at least one guest, maybe two, if I'm not making a mistake with my memory. And that's a human dynamic there. Our memories are not perfect. But at least one guest talked about within their company, they had a monthly contest for, I think they framed it as the best mistake or the mistake of the month. And, it wasn't a huge financial reward. I mean, I don't think they were afraid that people were going to start intentionally doing things wrong so they could win the mistake of the month award. But, doing things that just sort of, I think, normalize the fact that we're human, we make mistakes. We need to recognize that. And, celebrate is an interesting word. I don't know if it's really celebrate as much as it is acknowledge. I think, in Silicon Valley, there's this talk of, fail fast, fail often. And I've heard some that sort of push a little bit of counterbalance of, well, let's not have a failure fetish. Failure
Right.
in and of itself is not great. Failure might be expected. And then I think how we respond to those failures or mistakes are key. Because I think part of the Silicon Valley idea is cycles of learning.
Right.
We've had a failure, we've made a mistake. Let's learn from it. Let's move forward better. Going back to Toyota, my mentors there would talk about small tests of change, which means small failures as a way of preventing large failures. And to me, that's where, there's parallels in this quote unquote lean startup methodology. You want to make mistakes early so that you can adjust and get as much of it as you figured out, get as much of it figured out as you can before you try to scale the business.
Yeah, I think, it's funny hearing you talk about that. I think it's such an important point as I think about my career, also spending a large part of my career as a solopreneur. I mean, what weeks do I not make a mistake? But I think sometimes it's hard to remember them because I'm constantly building on top of it. I'm learning from it and building. I'm almost building over it. I'm back in the day. I used to do a lot of paintings and portraits, and every time as an artist you're doing a painting or portrait, you're always making a mistake, but you're covering it up with some other paint. So
Literally,
you're literally covering it up. And you're building on it. So at the end, it looks like everything was intentional and perfect, but there was mistakes made along the way. And I think you even see that with like famous portraits when they'll do all the analysis to it and they'll say, actually, there's like another portrait underneath this, or there's half of a tree on the left side of this portrait. Mark, this has been absolutely fascinating. So I ask all my guests this closing question. What is one life hack you have for us on how we can either have healthier conversations, better conversations, or healthier relationships, either at work or at home?
So I think, kind of building on the idea of, don't blame people, don't blame individuals for systemic problems. One of the other things that I've learned to not blame people for is being quote unquote resistant to change. So I think this is more of a workplace issue.
Yeah.
And in my work in healthcare, I've been fortunate through a social worker that I was talking to. I got introduced to a concept called motivational interviewing, which has its origins in quite literally counseling and therapy, which I thought you might be interested in considering this as workplace therapy. So motivational interviewing is a really rich topic, and obviously we can't get into all of that, but I think one of the key lessons, whether you're counseling an individual or working with people in the workplace is how freely people throw about the phrase, well, they're just being resistant to change. And motivational interviewing teaches us that resistance is a natural and an expected part of the change process.
Right. So
when you demonize that resistance, then you get things like passive aggressive, which is going along with it. So, there are ways managers can force compliance, but I would argue nobody's ever built a world-class organization on a culture of compliance,
right,
of doing what you're told and not questioning things. So I think just reframing resistance instead of it being a problem, recognizing it's to be expected, and then motivational interviewing teaches us, and I've been able to apply this in the workplace, when people are sort of stuck. I have reasons to do something, and I have reasons why it's challenging, to help work people through to the point where they can articulate their motivations for change. And that's why it's called motivational interviewing. I'm not telling you what your motivation is, but I'm drawing it out of you, and that strengthens somebody's commitment to change to where now that balance can tip to a point where they feel more capable or more confident moving forward and trying something. So that's a phrase I've tried to strike from my vocabulary altogether. Or if I catch myself thinking it, step back and say, wait a minute, they're not a bad person who's being resistant to change. This is the starting point for the change effort.
As you were talking, it made me think of, I don't know if you're familiar with this martial arts form. It's called Aikido.
No.
And it's interesting. It's from Japan. A lot of martial arts is from Japan. But this particular form, the whole premise of Aikido is you never attack your opponents. You redirect their energy. So this feels kind of like corporate Aikido, right? We're taking that resistance, which is an energy, and we're going to, through motivational interviewing, we're going to redirect that energy so it can be positive. So it can go in the direction we want it to go rather than against us, which that was, at least that's how my brain worked as I heard you talking.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And again, like motivational interviewing can only strengthen motivation that's already there. Like, so this is not about manipulating people. Like, I hate it when a leader says, like, we're gonna make them feel like it was their idea. Like, no, time out. No, that's manipulative. That's not ideal. But when somebody has, again, like their reasons to change and reasons not to change, we can build upon that in a way that strengthens. Like when leaders say, I want to, or I need to, or I know I should be, there is some motivation there, and we can tap into that instead of just brushing them aside, telling them get on the bus or whatever types of things leaders might say. Really try to invoke real change instead of forcing compliance.
Yeah. Mark, this has been absolutely fantastic. So if people want to learn more about you, follow you, listen to your podcast, where can they go?
So maybe the easiest domain, it's myfavoritemistakepodcast.com. That will redirect you to the page for my podcast, which is part of markgraban.com. And people can see from the menu there links to my books and different things that I do. Or they can just search My Favorite Mistake Podcast in whatever podcast directory they listen to.
Fantastic, my friend. This was great stuff. I'm going to go off and start making some mistakes.
and thank you for recognizing and maybe for you and for everybody, it's a matter of just being more aware of it and then kind of reflecting, okay, what are we going to do to maybe not repeat the same mistakes over and over. So Brendan, thank you for having me here as a guest. Thanks for having that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely love my conversation with Mark. What you don't know is this is the third time of me recording the post-interview with Mark and summarizing my notes because I made mistakes in the first two. So how ironic that we're talking about mistakes and I just made a couple. So I love that show because partly, number one, it reminds us we all make mistakes and we don't want to linger on those. We want to learn from those. And I think Mark was so clear on that as the main message of the show. If you took away anything from the show, take away this idea of continuous improvement. We all make mistakes. It's how quickly and how effectively can we learn from those? So embrace them. So when I asked Mark, as individuals, how do we get more comfortable with it? He said, stop beating yourself up. Acknowledge you're going to make mistakes. Stop beating yourself up and try and find ways to learn from it quickly and create that as kind of a mechanism and pattern in your head. And then I said, well, what about organizationally? What can we do better? And you heard him talk about it regularly. He said almost always when there's mistakes in an organization, they're systemic. It's really not about the person. So don't blame an employee or blame a colleague. It's probably something bigger that caused that issue. So look at the issue. And then he brought up, which is probably one of the themes of 2021 for this show, psychological safety. We've got to have psychological safety to feel comfortable enough to make mistakes. But he mentioned a really important point about psychological safety that I don't ever talk about, and I probably should. And that is that when we have psychological safety, we feel comfortable challenging the status quo. And if we don't have psychological safety, we're not going to challenge the status quo. And so we want to create that environment so we can challenge the status quo. We want to avoid things like naming and blaming and shaming. He mentioned that he sees a lot of that in the healthcare world where he's working. We want to kind of avoid that stuff. And again, psychological safety can help us with that. And they talked about in Toyota the and-on cord, which is the cord that the workers can pull. If there's an issue on the assembly line, they're not going to get in trouble when they pull that, but it's just an opportunity to come over and say, what's happened here? What can we do to get it better? How do we kind of create our versions and mechanisms for that? So I love the show. I took away a lot from it, helping me to kind of rethink on some of the mistakes I've made and how I can learn from those. I hope you got the same benefit from the show as I did.
It's my favorite part of the show is when we get to share the reviews from our listeners. Today's comes from Donut Paw, who says, this is a must-have show in your library podcast list, and gave us 5 stars. Thanks so much, Donut Paw. And says this, I love listening to the Workplace Therapist show. Brandon does a wonderful job engaging with guests who have keen insights and innovative ideas in the world of work and career. I learn something new every time I listen in. Keep them coming. Thanks so much for that great review. And if you haven't left us a review yet, we'd love to hear from you. Head on over wherever it is you listen and give us some ratings and stars. We truly appreciate your feedback.